Hi everyone. So today in this lecture we're going to conclude our close reading of The Individual and His Religion by Gordon Allport, his 1950 text. And I've used this text to introduce you to the humanistic approach to the psychology of religion. And also it can be understood, as we'll see today, as an entrance into phenomenological psychology, existential psychology. Often the two are combined and considered under the title existential phenomenological psychology, and the similarities are very close to humanism. So at this stage, undergraduate psychology, you can think of humanism and existential phenomenology as the same school of thought. But as you get into graduate school and you do more reading and more investigation, you'll understand that there are some subtle differences between the two. Sometimes not so subtle differences. Oh my goodness, this chapter, chapter 6, the nature of faith. As I went through this, I use a pencil and I make notes in the margins, and it sometimes what you have is so rich. What Allport has provided to us, I feel like I'm going to be reading the entire chapter to you. Don't get your hopes up. I won't be. But I am going to try to hit on as much of this chapter as we can. It's just so rich with stuff, useful psychological insights to belief, the nature of faith. Well, let's start out. Allport in chapter 6 talks about, to conclude his humanistic study, he talks about this 3 stages of belief. So let me give that to you. Number 1, in the previous chapter I stated that belief normally seems to develop in 3 stages. There is at first a period of raw credulity, most clearly seen in the child who believes indiscriminately in the evidence of his senses, of his imagination, and in what he hears. His first religious beliefs are derived chiefly from what he hears, that is, from verbal realism. To him, words are as good as facts. That some of this primitive credulity lasts throughout life is evident, but chiefly, I think, in minds marked by arrested development, or in areas where we are starkly ignorant or in the face of strong prestige or suggestion. Some religious belief among adults is of this unquestioning variety. It's childish, authoritarian, and irrational. This would definitely be immature belief. And we've studied this before, so this is really a recap of what we went into in previous chapters, what Allport went into in previous chapters. 2, normally, however, the second stage of development disrupts the first. Doubts of the many sorts, remember we did a whole chapter on doubts, we have considered flooding into one's life. They are an integral part of the intelligent thinking. Until one has faced the improbabilities involved in any commitment, one is not free from an independent conviction based on productive thinking and observing. So for Allport, doubt is essential to belief. And 3rd, mature belief. The 3rd stage grows painfully out of the alternating doubts and affirmations that characterize productive thinking. We evolve our important beliefs pari passu with our values and sentiments. This term pari passu means alongside with, so in parallel with. We evolve our important beliefs along with our values and sentiments. When I say I believe in education and civil rights in the United Nations, I believe that these intangible objects are regarded by me not only as existing but also desirable and wholly consonant with my personal sentiment structure. Sentiment structure. This is fascinating. They are necessary to me if I am to fulfill the course of development that has now become my essential style of life. He says, for without belief, one could not act in keeping with one's sentiment, and if one could not act out one's sentiment, one soon would lose them. It is important to remark that beliefs may be held with all grades of certainty. Even a relatively unsure belief can marshal a great deal of energy. So belief can come in certain strengths: weak belief, moderate belief, and strong belief. But even the weakest belief can marshal a great deal of energy and motivation for an individual. One does not know for certain that the United Nations can save civilization from collapse, but one can be loyal and helpful if one at least believes there is a good chance. Boy, this is Allport's summary of the three stages of going from immature childhood, childish belief, to mature belief. And he uses the term arrested development. This is a term you may have heard because it's been made popular. But what arrested development means is it's similar to what Freud described as a fixation in a certain period of childhood as an adult. Something happens. What comes to mind immediately is Nabokov's incredible book, Lolita. If you read Nabokov's account of Lolita, we have an adult male, a middle-aged man, who had a certain adolescent sexual frustration. During adolescence, the natural course of his sexual expression was thwarted, was frustrated in adolescence, and that became the fetishized situation. As an adult, having sexual relation with someone of that age group of adolescence. This is the classic understanding of fixation, and this is very similar to this immature belief system of arrested development. An adult that becomes arrested in a certain emotional period of childhood or of adolescence. So Allport goes on, is faith the same as belief, he asks. Often the words are used interchangeably, although more often there's a difference in connotation. We tend to speak of faith when we are designating the less sure beliefs. We believe in our eyes. We believe in the proposition that twice 2 equals 4, 2 times 2 is 4. But we have faith in America, or in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. There is, of course, a borderline of discourse where we can use either term. I believe in the United Nations, which means much the same as I have faith in the United Nations. So he tells us that faith seems to carry a warmer glow of affection than does belief. Faith has more to do with hope. Belief has more to do with a sense of assurance. It suggests that though the risk may be greater, still the commitment is stronger than the outcome of the wager, more precious. So in faith has less to do with evidence and less to do with outcome than belief. This is very fascinating. He's getting into our emotional relationship with concepts that we have words for. The word faith, the word belief, we throw these around very recklessly. And he's demonstrating in this chapter, as he has the entire book, he's demonstrating a great sensitivity to language and to what our emotional and intellectual relationship to words and concepts are. Most people, when asked, they say they believe in God. But in many of these cases, the reply seems perfunctory, and one suspects that the religious sentiment behind the statement is rudimentary. But when an individual says, I have faith in God, it seems almost certain that the religious sentiment holds a prominent place in the personality structure. So this is fascinating. Faith has these deep psychological implications that are distinctly different and in some ways more impacting than belief. This is very fascinating to think about. Faith versus belief. He points out then that faith is probably the more complex psychologically than belief is. I don't know, but that's his proposal. So he now has he describes the religious intention, and he gives us 3 unique characteristics of religious sentiment. And remember, again, sentiment is feeling, emotion, a certain perspective. That's what sentiment is, as we've described it in previous chapters. So it is certainly, he says, the maturely productive religious sentiment, I have argued throughout these pages, is an interest system. Interest, this is going to be very fundamental to humanistic psychology. An interest system with the structure of an individual's personality, basically like any other well-developed interest system. What is interest? We won't put the cart before the horse, so let's look at his 3 unique characteristics of religious sentiment. 1, it is certainly more comprehensive, since it aims to join all experience into a single meaningful system. So he's saying that religious sentiment, rather than looking just at isolated incidences or phenomena, he is saying that religious sentiment is something that's seeking like an overall integration of disparate events into some sort of meaningful, purposeful whole. It is likewise a uniquely integral system in that it aims to give one leading directive to the life as a whole. So in other words, it is purposeful. It built within it is a sentiment of purpose, meaning, purpose. Remember those 4 big existential questions: meaning, purpose, responsibility are 2 of the big ones. Finally, because of the limited certainties that plague any religious belief, there is an heuristic quality to this sentiment. It is held with loyalty for the very purpose of discovering all the good and all the truth that may issue from it. So he then wants to get at, in the next section, he gives 2 historical theological passages that he says gets us to the crux of sentiment, gets us closest to the feelings of sentiment, of religious sentiment. He says, now it seems to me at the end that these distinctive features of the religious sentiment must lead us to expect a somewhat distinctive character in religious faith, as opposed to any other sort of faith. Specifically, I propose that we look for that peculiar character in mature religious faith that attends its comprehensiveness, its integral, and its heuristic character. And we're going to look at Thomas à Kempis, The Intentions of Christ. He says, "Comfort my banishment, assuage my sorrow, for my whole desire sigheth after thee." This is one of the 2 theological quotes that Allport is going to examine to get at this religious sentiment. He says the phrase, "my whole desire sigheth after thee." Now think about this. My whole desire. Desire is a key word. Sigheth, that's longing. It's physical reaction to desire. And after thee, after presumably God, expresses with classic simplicity the attributes of comprehensiveness and integrality, interaction in the developed religious sentiment. The second quotation, we're going to parse this out, but here's to help us understand. The second quotation, "If God were always the pure intention of our desire, we should not be so easily troubled." Both of these are talking about intention. Desire, intention, a focus of purpose. And this is what he's proposing is at the core of religious sentiment. Is it not saying that if faith were adequate, the believer would find his riddles solved and his anxieties allayed? He would make discoveries of knowledge and of virtue. God, he says, is the pure intention of our desire. What does he mean? Now, where Allport is about to take us is phenomenal. He's talking about the study of intention. And what he goes on to tell us, and he gives us this history. You're going to read here about Franz Brentano and act psychology. Now, unless you've studied the history of psychology, you don't know about Brentano. But Brentano is really this figure in the history of psychology that we can link back. We can watch this lineage go from humanism through Gestalt psychology, the Gestalt psychologists, act psychologists, to psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, to phenomenology, existentialism. Franz Brentano was a Catholic priest who left the priesthood, and he developed what's called act psychology. In the history of psychology, act psychology, these words, as Allport gives this great critique of how in 1950, and we can argue that this is presently true as well, that was absent from psychology is intention. Behaviorism looked only, in 1950, behaviorism was the paradigm. Cognitive psychology entered mind back into the question, but it took this idea, it still only looks at desire or intention as something very, you typically talk about the 4 F's: fighting, flighting, fleeing, fornicating, so having sex, and freezing, doing nothing. Behaviorism looked at reward and punishment schedules. That's it, Cognitive psychology gives you those 4 F's. But we seldom ask, what is the intention? What's the motivation? And that's what humanism offers. That's what act psychology is. Act psychology, the term ACT, we think act as activity, as some kind of physical thing that we do. This is a layover of behaviorism. Here, act is the intention. It's the thought, the desire. It's the motivation in the crime. When you go to a criminal court, you can look at the action, the activity, the behavior. Someone stole a loaf of bread. But in order to truly understand what has taken place and to decide the ethicality or the legality of the situation, one maturely looks at the intention of the action. Why the person stole the loaf of bread. An immature or stunted or pre-conventional understanding of ethics is the law was broken, right or wrong, period. It's very simplistic. And you have adults who think this way. The law is the law, period. A mature, post-conventional understanding of ethics asks the question, what is the motivation? The person stole a loaf of bread because their child or their sick wife was dying of hunger, starvation. You see, this is where ethics and morality intersect with legality. It's a mature looking at the world. Intention. Now, this rich stuff, the meaning of intention. So just remember, when you read this idea of act psychology, Brentano's idea of act psychology, if you haven't taken my history of psychology course, go online, look for my lectures on Brentano, and you will have a deeper understanding of this. I know that this is enough for you to read right now, but this is just looking toward the future. If this is important to you and you want to look more into this, this is so important. What Allport offers us here is that what we are missing in contemporary psychology, in 1950s with behaviorism, and currently in cognitive psychology, which simply looks at mental actions rather than intentions, mental processes rather than intentions, and dismisses intentions as something that's largely not within the scope of psychology. Allport saying this is exactly what we have to look at in psychology, is the individual's intention in the context of their activity, of their behavior, and of their thought processes. How does the thought process serve the intention? In biological psychology, today the fad is to call it neuroscience. It's the same thing: genetics, endocrine system, and nervous system. We have the tendency to dismiss something as nothing but brain chemicals, nothing but genetics, without looking at the intention. We kind of build the intention into the chemical, or into the brain structure, or into the genetics. This is what Allport's critiquing here in his study of religious belief, intention, act. He says it is typical of American psychology that it refused to accommodate itself to Brentano's conception of the mental act. What would we practical-minded people do with a mere mental act? We prefer physical acts, visible accomplishments, results. Behaviorism is more our style. The very word act is hard for an American to understand unless it means moving a muscle. While Brentano would not deny the motor concomitants of mental activity, still to him the important thing is what the individual is trying to do in relating himself to the objects of his own thinking, not what he is seen externally accomplishing. Do you see this? Motivation, intention, purpose. He says, this is where religion and psychology meet. A sentiment, Allport tells us, is no mere static fitting of the mind, a simple storehouse for a cluster of related ideas and values. That's what we do today in cognitive psychology. We talk of long-term memory, short-term memory, these storehouses of concepts without any interest in intention and purpose. He says, it is rather a mainspring in the individual's life from which radiate all manner of intentions whose purpose is to fulfill the values comprising the sentiment. What's a mainspring? It's the battery of the watch. Years ago we had mechanical watches and you wound the watch. Today you can get self-winding watches, mostly battery-powered watches today. But the mainspring is the energy source for which the individual behaves. And Allport's telling us that's what we have to get at in psychology. The mainspring. What's the mainspring within the human condition? It's the intention. It's the desire. It's the motivation. Incredible stuff. He then goes on to add in that we in psychology could take a lesson from the psychodynamic folks. And what is that? Unconscious motivation. Sometimes we act and tell ourselves a story of what our motivation is. And the true motivation we keep hidden from ourselves. He's saying this is something we need to take into consideration. The goal of an intention, as Brentano pointed out, is always represented to the mind as an idea. The person intends to reach such and such an objective as conceived by himself. If you propound me a riddle, I seek an answer. I am intending a goal. He says occasionally the object sought, though held in mind as an idea, conforms closely to some outward condition. Thus, a century ago, it was common to say, so in the 1800s, it was common to say, I intend for England this spring, or I intend for Ohio. And he's saying that we've now shifted to saying, I intend to go to England. I intend to go to Ohio. And he's telling us that this has changed our relationship to the word intention. We say, I intend to go to England this spring. I intend to buy a new coat. I intend to study philosophy. Yet many times the goal of an intention is not so clear, not even to the individual self who hungers from the resulting strivings to be acutely felt. So the very act here shifts from the intention to the object. Whereas in the past we spoke more intimately and were more in contact with the focus of the intention itself rather than the destination of the intention. What happens next is fascinating because Allport is about to do something remarkable, make a link between Catholic theology and psychology. Now, why is this important? Well, because at the heart of humanism, I know humanism was a reaction against Catholicism. It was a reaction against sacred by the secular. But at the heart of humanism is Christian theology. You can look at the lineage of the thought that goes into humanism, into existentialism. I'm thinking of Martin Heidegger. It's a deeply Catholic endeavor. In developing his psychology of the act, Brentano was influenced by Catholic theology, which, perceiving the vital part of intention plays in the practice of rationale of religion, has given it a prominent place. Catholic writing defines intention as an act of will, willfulness, willing, hoping, desiring, tending efficaciously to some good proposed by the intellect as desirable and obtainable. I want to remind you, in existentialism, we have two forms of existentialism. We have secular existentialism and we have Christian existentialism. On one side, we have Nietzsche with secular existentialism. On the second side, we have Kierkegaard with Christian existentialism. Remember, both speak of a calling. I talked about this in earlier lectures. Both speak of a calling. We have to tap into our calling. The existential psychologist, the human psychologist, doesn't say, who am I? They say, who should I be? And they listen for the calling. The Christian existentialism, that calling, that purpose comes from God. In secular existentialism, the purpose, the calling in our lives comes from within ourselves. The existentialist doesn't ask, doesn't read a book, find yourself. The existentialist writes the book, create yourself. The first key into creating yourself is to listening to the calling that comes from within. He says, in Catholic theological writing concerning intention, there are 2 points of special value for us. One is that the intention is never indifferent from the means employed. To desire an end is to desire the appropriate means. If a person intends health for himself, he is bound to intend the means to achieve health. In other words, our special attitudes towards ritual, towards prayer, or matters of doctrine provide particular aids through which we carry out the more intention of the whole sentiment, the rituals of the religious belief. Prayers, meetings, all these things that go along with it. Built in is the structure of intention. To live in that style of life satisfies the questions that initiate that style of life. Secondly, Catholic theology has made us aware of 4 grades of intention. There is a psychological value in this fourfold analysis. So this is psychology of religion coming directly from Catholic theology. An intention is said to be actual when it expressly asserts the end desired. It is kept in mind while action is taking place. If one intends to worship God and proceeds with his devotions to this end, his intention is actual. So the first style of intention is an actual intention. You know what your goal is, and everything you do is focused with that in the back of your mind, that goal. Second, intention is virtual. When a person has made a previous commitment but does not feel the need for reaffirming it, having decided to travel to Paris in 6 months, I do not need to repeat the decision. Once it's made and not retracted, the intention is efficacious until it is carried through. A person who has decided to order his life according to religious pattern finds this decision influencing his daily conduct even at times he's not or she not aware of it. So in this type of intention, you've accepted a way of life, a religious way of life. And now you don't have to think of it constantly, you just go through with it. The third intention is in the Catholic sense, is habitual. It has never been carried out. Once made and never retracted, it has lapsed from active memory, or at least fails to instigate conduct. I say I will take out insurance or paint my house or give up drinking, but it's just don't get around to it. Habitual intentions in this theological sense seem to be those which hell is paved. Here's a prime example of this. The individual who's an alcoholic who says, I wish I could stop drinking. This is a habitual desire. It's empty. One just can't. It's almost like they've split themselves into two people. The one who's drinking and the one who wishes they didn't drink. You see, this is a habitual desire. It's complicated, and it's the person sincerely experiences that they would like to stop drinking. They just can't help themselves to stop drinking. But in this analysis, the desire is an empty habitual desire. Coming into contact, say in addictions counseling, the method here would be coming into contact not with one's wish that they could stop drinking, but one's strong desire to drink. That would be the central authenticity of desire, of intention. Finally, there are cases where intentions have not been made, but we can safely infer they would have been made if the individual had been aware of the opportunity. We can assume, for example, that a good parent would intend to supply the best of vitamins for his child if he knew what they were. This grade of intention the theologians call interpretive, a disposition of the will towards having an intention. So this is a more complicated psychological aspect of things that the Catholic theology is proposing. This would be an intention that one assumes is there but doesn't quite have the direction or the ability to saddle into activity. We assume, for example, that a good parent would intend to supply the best vitamins for his child if he knew what they were. So the intention would be there, but the action, it's empty. There's no action because there's no knowledge on how to fulfill the intention. The psychological value of this subtle analysis lies in its demonstration that people who maintain a religious orientation may do so in a variety of ways. In a person, the virtual intention predominates. Such an individual, we may say, lives his religion, though he rarely affirms it explicitly. In another, the carrying out of a frequent devotional actual intention may be the distinguishing mark. Another individual may seem to us almost unintentionally religious. From his behavior, we feel certain he would make a religious choice if he were confronted with the issue. But the fact is only interpretive. Here's the punchline to this statement. There are many varieties and combinations of religious intention possible for different mortals and for any one mortal at different times. So getting to one intention and creating that as our description would be futile in this endeavor. It's complicated. The next thing that he turns to, although he doesn't explicitly say this, is teleology. And this is the idea of intention being something that is a goal that pulls us towards it. So you're taking this class, and in conventional psychological, Western psychology cause and effect terms, you might say your desire to get a college degree is causing you to take this course. Your desire to have knowledge about religion and psychology is causing you to take the course in psychology. For some of you, maybe very superficially, your mom or dad is making you take a college course or expecting you to take the college courses, and that's the cause of the effect, you being in this class. Teleology is central to humanism, and it dismisses the idea of cause and effect and instead looks at what is pulling us towards a goal. Teleology is the concept, comes from Aristotle, is the concept that you, in your mind, have a sense of what you could be, fulfilling your potential. And that future self, the person who you see 10 years from now, 5 years from now, after the person with a college degree, the person maybe writing books or being a therapist, or maybe having a certain job with certain prestige or certain financial rewards, or whatever, freeing yourself of time of having to go to an office 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Maybe that's your goal with your education. Whatever this is, that future being, the ideal self that you see, you're being pulled towards this person. And in this way, your current taking of this course is not caused by some motivation from behind. It's actually pulling towards what you possibly could be. It's interesting to note that Alfred Adler noted that some people don't act on that. Instead, begin to feel inferior to what they could be. They sit on the couch, they watch the television, they don't pursue their dreams, their purpose. You see this is central to this. So this is where he puts in intention is something that pulls us. Think about this ideal self you have, who you want to be, and how you're currently acting on being the pull towards that goal. He gives this great analogy. I love this. He says, current psychology looks at people riding a train and doesn't ask the question, what's their destination? Intention, purpose. You're going to read this, of course. Prayer and ritual. Allport. So I'm just going to touch on this. Please read carefully, because I'm skipping over tremendous amounts of insight into the human condition and religious belief. Prayer and ritual. For Allport, prayer and ritual. And prayer is our personal... Well, there's different types of prayer that he goes into. There's different intentions in the prayer. Mature religious prayer seeks to come into contact with insight, into unity with a greater whole. Immature prayer seeks to self-serve. Ritual and dogma. The word dogma simply means belief. So everybody has dogma, belief. Dogmatism is when you think your belief is the best or only belief and criticize other beliefs. That's dogmatism. But dogma is what we all have. We all have dogma. Dogma and ritual serves the purpose to bring us out of our aloneness and to have communion with others, to make friends, to be part of a community. And a central part of the religious experience is community with others. And in this way, we can consider things like art and music and going to college, joining a fraternity or a sorority. All these things are dogma, a belief and a ritual that brings us together. I'm really skipping over this section and just consolidating it for you to have a better understanding when you read it in depth. There's a whole section here on how the individual validates his faith. In other words, how do we come to trust in our faith? And having read this, I wrote a couple of big notes to myself here, and these are some thoughts that came to my mind in reading this validation. It seems to me that religious faith and validation comes down to a matter of trust versus distrust. The skeptic, the cynic, has a built-in distrust. Trust seems to be the overriding characteristic of one who has faith. Being able to trust. Now, what am I talking about? Trust in what? Well, I believe it comes down to comfort with ambiguity. Comfort with that which we have no evidence empirically, experientially, but phenomenologically we do. The difference between logic and intuition, between thinking and feeling, between that which cannot speak and that which we can express in language. Often an individual who has a comfort with ambiguity is more inclined to be open to thinking rather than knowing, to experiencing rather than controlling. Control can be expressed. Scientists want to control. You go through research methods over and over how to control variables, to isolate and to cause and effect relationships. And of course, one of the motivations of religion is control, trying to control one's destiny, one's future, etc. It brings us back to William James, and Allport brings us back to William James in the conclusion of this. So be sure to make note of that. I want to conclude our little discussion here of Allport's book with his concluding sentiments, the solitary way. My theme has been, Allport tells us, the diversity of form that subjective religion assumes. Many different desires may initiate the religious quest. Desires as contrasting as fear, curiosity, gratitude, conformity. Men, of course, and women too, show a varying capacity to outgrow their childhood religion and to evolve a well-differentiated, mature religious sentiment. There are many degrees in the comprehensiveness of this sentiment and its power to integrate the life. There are different styles of doubting, different apperceptions of symbols, contrasting types of content that vary both with the culture and with the temperament and capacity of the believer. There are innumerable types of specific religious intentions. How the individual justifies his faith is a variable matter, and the certitude he achieves is his alone. This just outlined all the variables that have been discussed in this book. From its early beginnings to the end of the road, the religious quest of the individual is solitary. Though he is socially something personal. Though he is socially interdependent with others in thousands of ways, yet no one else is able to provide him with the faith he evolves, nor prescribes for him the pact with the cosmos. Often the religious sentiment is merely rudimentary in the personality, but often too it is pervasive structure marked by the deepest sincerity. It is the portion of personality that arises at the core of the life and is directed towards the infinite. It is the region of mental life that has longest range intentions, and for this reason is capable of conferring marked integration upon personality, engendering meaning and peace in the face of tragedy and confusion of life. A man's religion is the audacious bid he makes to bind himself to creation and the Creator, to the bigger picture. It is his ultimate attempt to enlarge and to complete his own personality by finding the supreme context in which he rightly belongs. This is a profound text. I think that he really, Allport, that is, really gives us a feel for a humanistic approach to understanding religious experience, the psychology of religion. His sensitivity, not only to how one behaves, but how one feels, one's motivations, one's thought patterns, goals, etc. He gives us, I think, such an example of sensitivity and willingness to combine thinking with evidence, with history, with radical empiricism, with looking beyond just quantitative methods, with looking beyond just psychology, looking into philosophy, theology, sociology, history. That's Gordon Allport and Humanistic Psychology of Religion.